EVs are dead, they have no range, and they take hours to charge. The future is clearly hydrogen. Well, how many times have you heard this one? Dave takes it on, digs into hydrogen, and looks into the facts and technology involved in powering a car on hydrogen, be that a hydrogen fuel cell or hydrogen combustion. Well, it's party time, so down to the card shop or supermarket and you pick up your helium balloons. Happy birthday, Christmas, whatever it says. You notice that the balloon is made of a special material. If you've ever got a helium cylinder and blown up a normal rubber or latex balloon, you already know it goes down really quickly. And this is our first problem. Helium atoms are tiny things, really tiny. And in a really simplistic explanation, the atoms are smaller than the gaps between the atoms in the rubber or latex. They just escape quite easily. Your balloon deflates quickly. Helium has an atomic weight of 4. Hydrogen has a weight of 1. So whatever is true for helium is doubly, quadruply true of hydrogen. It's even tinier and an absolute nightmare to produce and store. Whatever you put it in, it escapes. Just ask BMW, who state that their hydrogen hybrid car, left at an airport for 2 weeks, will lose all of its hydrogen before you get back. So we hit problem number 1. Producing it, storing it, using it, it escapes. It is not friendly to work with. So let's start with, how do you actually make it? There are 2 methods, electrolysis and chemical. For the moment, I'm going to ignore chemical because this is the method that will actually win, and also at the same time, it will kill hydrogen cars stone dead. Now, all governments are in the process of banning ICE cars, not because they don't like them. They've been the mainstay of many countries' economies for decades. The real reason they're being banned, and ultra-low emission zones are springing up everywhere, is because of the pollution. Exhaust emissions kill people. It's also the reason why gas-fired boilers for central heating in the UK are to be banned from 2035. And in New York from 2036, being replaced by heat pumps. The exhaust emissions from burning natural gas kill people too. Now, in an ideal world, we'll take a wind or PV farm and simply use the electricity to break down water. H2O turns into 2H and 1O, so there's no shortage of water. You don't need fresh water. You can happily electrolyse seawater or even wet sewage. Put in electricity and hydrogen bubbles off one terminal and oxygen bubbles off the other. It's really simple. I hear all the time that renewable energy is really cheap, so just use some of our grid to produce hydrogen. You can't. The grid does not store electricity, not yet, so it produces only what it needs. Almost all of the electricity in the grid is already spoken for. It runs my house, the shops I go to, the factories, the farms, the streetlights and the internet. People against EVs often say, well, there's not enough electricity to charge all the EVs, but then ignore the fact that there's not enough electricity to run electrolysis plants making hydrogen either. To make hydrogen by electrolysis, first you need to buy or build a wind farm or a PV farm. Now, a hydrogen electrolysis plant just got really expensive, but let's move on. Now, remember the last time you went abroad, you changed £100, say, into euros or dollars and went away. When you got back, you had some left, let's say £100. You tried to turn that amount of euros or dollars back into sterling and found you only got £90. Each transaction took a little bit for themselves. And exactly the same is true for all energy, storage and usage. For EV batteries, the figure is around 90%. If you buy 100 kilowatts of electricity, you only get to store about 95 kilowatts. And if you use it, you'll only be able to take out 90. Exactly the same is true with hydrogen. If you put 100 kilowatts of electricity into the electrolysis machine, it doesn't produce 100 kilowatt hours equivalent of hydrogen. The true production efficiency is around 75%. So you get 75 kilowatt hour equivalent of hydrogen gas. Well, that's not too bad. It's worse than batteries, but 2 or 3 times better than the very best ICE cars, which hover around 20 to 25% efficiency. But we then come to store it. If you just leave the hydrogen, as BMW have stated, it'll disappear in a few weeks. So the best way to stop this is to compress it into a liquid which doesn't escape anywhere near so easily. This compression process takes energy out of the process. When you compress it, you use energy, but also produce heat. Think of a bicycle pump. It gets very hot when you pump it and compress the air going into your tyre. So you not only need to compress the hydrogen, but you also need to cool it. This also takes energy. So in efficiency term, anything that costs energy is not good. With gaseous hydrogen, you need to spend an additional 10% of the energy to compress it and store it. So already, you've lost 35%. That's over 1/3 of the energy you started with. Now, you have to use it to propel the car. And this also, guess what? Not 100% efficient. If you decide to burn it in a specially designed internal combustion engine, which would work, they do exist, you again hit that 20 to 25% efficiency of turning hydrogen into movement. Most of the energy goes off in heat. So with the hydrogen car, you've already lost 35% of the energy. You would lose a further 75 to 80% of what remains in making the car move. And that is not a good use of energy. I would not expect any hydrogen systems to be revealed anytime soon that will run your old ICE car with just a minor modification. Everyone uses hydrogen fuel cells. So the hydrogen fuel cell takes hydrogen and mixes it with oxygen from the air and produces electricity. Wait for it. You're probably already one step ahead of me. Yep, that process costs energy. Typically 30% of the hydrogen energy going into the fuel cell is just lost. So the equation for hydrogen now looks like this. 100 kilowatt of electricity produced from a wind or PV farm produces 75 kilowatt hours equivalent in the form of hydrogen, which drops to 65 kilowatts as a compressed cold liquid. When we drive, that 65 kilowatts drops to 35 kilowatt hours usable. In plain English, you can only use 1/3 of the energy it takes to make hydrogen to propel your car, which is only a little bit more efficient than the current ICE car. Or to put it another way, a battery electric BEV can take that original energy from the wind or PV farm and drive 3 times further than a hydrogen car using exactly the same initial energy. Here we hit the first major financial setback for hydrogen. The grid is already short of clean green electricity and willing to pay a high price for any and all you can produce. If you have to buy a wind farm or PV farm to make hydrogen, and that produces a set quantity of electricity, you're faced with a choice. Are you going to sell it to the grid? Are you going to sell it to EVs? Or are you going to sell just 35% of it to your hydrogen electrolysis farm next door and just throw away the 65% in inefficiencies? Well, duh, that's an absolute no-brainer. The answer is determined by simple business practice. Almost all electricity produced will be sold to the highest bidder. Nobody in the right mind would just bin 65% of it and sell the small amount remaining to a business venture that is not yet a mass market. And that is why, no, not the hydrogen will fail. I don't believe that for a minute. It will succeed. But that is why nobody will mass produce hydrogen by electrolysis in large quantities in the future. The economics simply don't add up when there's an even better, more efficient and cheaper option: synthetic hydrogen or blue hydrogen. or synthetic hydrogen. It's a mixture of hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and a small amount of carbon dioxide. It's created by reacting natural gas with high-temperature steam. The carbon monoxide is reacted with water to produce additional hydrogen. And this method is already the cheapest, most efficient, and the most common. Natural gas reforming using steam already accounts for the majority of hydrogen produced in the United States annually. So incorporating carbon capture and storage in the process can produce hydrogen with lower carbon dioxide emissions. Well, it still has huge inefficiencies compared to battery storage, but it has one absolutely massive, compelling, essential element that makes it the clear winner. It uses natural gas as the raw ingredient. So look, between now and 2030 in the UK and 2035 everywhere else, as more people buy EVs, fewer and fewer people will buy petrol or diesel at the pumps. After the deadlines, nobody can buy a new ICE car that uses petrol or diesel. None. Those existing ICE cars are still allowed to drive around. They can still be bought and sold. But realise the average life of an ICE car is 10 to 12 years. So by 2040, there will hardly be any petrol or diesel cars still on the road. They'll all have gone to the scrapyard. The market for petrol and diesel will rapidly wither away to almost nothing. And the same is true for natural gas. By 2035 in the UK and 2036 in places like New York, the sale of new gas-fired central heating boilers will be banned, replaced by heat pumps which run on electricity. The average life of a central heating boiler is 10 to 15 years. So again, but this time about 2045, there will be almost none left, and there'll be almost no demand for natural gas. The huge multi-billion-dollar empires will cease to exist, unless the petrochemical companies can persuade us to drive hydrogen fuel cars in huge numbers, and then convince governments around the world to allow them to use gas as the raw material for the hydrogen they will need by calling it blue hydrogen, and also be allowed to produce the huge amounts of pollution that extracting and transporting that gas to refineries using fossil fuels produces, and the pollution that using fossil fuels to refine the gas into hydrogen produces, to be permitted if they promise, fantasy, carbon capture technology and carbon offsetting. Well, carbon capture technology does not yet exist, and if it ever does, it will simply add a huge cost to an already very expensive fuel. Carbon credits are already getting really expensive, getting dearer by the day, but future laws will probably do away with them altogether at some point to be replaced by even stricter pollution control. I do not believe any business can succeed if the electricity they produce or buy is used to hydrolyze water. I do believe that we will see an absolutely massive drive by the petrochemical industry to convince us drivers that EVs are useless but hydrogen is brilliant. I also see an absolutely humongous campaign to persuade governments around the world that the only way to produce sufficient clean green hydrogen is to allow them to produce that from natural gas, with their massive claims about carbon capture technology and carbon offsetting. They would be mad not to, because the alternative is the total collapse of the largest companies this planet has ever seen within the next 20 to 30 years. That will never be an option. I just hope they lose that battle. I desperately hope that if they market themselves as truly worldwide energy companies, that they just switch from oil-based products to renewable products, and using PV panels, wind turbines or other new technologies not yet mainstream. Please, Shell, BP and all the rest, just switch your business to green energy. Well, thanks for watching to the end. Please subscribe and hit the like button. It makes a big difference, and becoming a Patreon member makes an even bigger financial difference. I'm Dave.